I don't know how much you know about the Wellcome Trust, but we're an organisation that fund biomedical science. We also have a very strong public engagement remit, which is why we work with the broadcasters to try and help improve the quality and the visibility of biomedicine in the media. We've also brought along with us 12 scientists, from a medic to people who are studying infectious diseases. We have a pharmacologist. We also have neuroscientists. So if any of you have got any mental or physical problems and want to know what drugs to take to help them, they're here for you to chat to. This session is called When is Science Not Science? And I will hand over to David Glover, who will explain more.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, if any one of you have even the most passing interest in science on television, you're in the right place today, because we have a pretty illustrious panel. We have Kim Schillinglaw, who's head of science and natural history on the BBC. Kate Techman, who's commissioning editor in Channel 4's features department, does some of Channel 4's most popular programmes. We've got David Ugan, who's chairman of Windfall Films, one of the independent production sector's most scientific production companies. And we've got Professor Steve Jones, who's a geneticist, author, presenter of science television, currently writing a report for the BBC about the state of science television. So, and you've got me, David Glover, and I do the science programmes on Channel 4. I'm responsible for some of them anyway. So what's it all about? I don't really understand the title myself, When is Science Not Science? But I'll tell you a story, which is that a few years ago, the Wellcome Trust sent some researchers out into the street with the following question. They said to the members of the public, they sent young researchers to ask members of the public, where do you get your science knowledge from? And they stopped members of the public in the street. The members of the public looked a bit startled and thought, Christ, I don't know. Luckily, it was a multiple choice, and so they said, do you get your science knowledge from science journals? And the members of the public shook their heads. How about the library? No. And then finally, it got to science television. And the members of the public said, yes, that's where I get my science knowledge from science television programmes. In fact, the members of the public probably said, yes, the missus likes soap operas and all that, but I love the science documentaries. But I think, so that's really good news, that survey. 73% saying they got their science knowledge from science television, which meant the Wellcome Trust has very kindly funded quite a lot of science television and helped back it on Channel 4 and other channels. But now I think there's a mood in the Wellcome Trust to try and expand the reach further, to try and kind of work out how we can engage audiences that might not come to a normal science documentary, and how we can get kind of really millions of people to engage in scientific subject matter. So we've got some very different strategies on this panel. We've got very different clip reels and very different personalities and very different ways of engaging people with science. So kind of I'm going to go through them really and basically introduce you to them and their way of thinking, and we'll kind of get some sense of how they do try and engage millions of people with scientific content. Then we're going to get Steve Jones to kind of interrogate them a little and see how they'd bring to life his area of science. And then, of course, it's up to you. So please do think of questions you'd like to fire at them. You know, are you happy with the state of science television? These are the people, we're the people responsible for quite a bit of it. So please feel free to have a go at us, question us, interrogate us. So there you go. Let's start with Kim Schillinglaw, head of science at the BBC, voted in the top 50 most influential people in science in the country. I wasn't on that list either.
I was number 109.
Tell me, in a nutshell, how do you bring science to millions of people?
Well, I think at the BBC we're incredibly fortunate. We're in a position of real privilege, and I think we're trying to sort of respond to that privilege more, which is that fundamentally that privilege is that we have 3 channels. I mean, we have 4 channels, but 3 channels that I'm responsible for providing output to: BBC One, BBC Two, and BBC Four. And what that allows us to do is think about science for very different sorts of audiences and provide that on a platform that sort of speaks to very different sorts of audiences. And I think that's really, really key to what we do. So we can do very different things on BBC Four to the things that we do on BBC One with science. And that sort of breadth and range is really central to what we're trying to do at the BBC with science. I think in the past, we've not really taken advantage of that in lots of ways, and we've not been very coherent about that, and we're trying to do a better job of it going forward. I think one of the ways that we've sort of mistakenly interpreted that sometimes in the past is that we've thought for instance, that meant there were certain content areas or subject areas that you did on BBC One and certain content areas and subject areas that you did on BBC Four, and then sort of two sets somewhere in between. And while, you know, there is a degree of truth in that, I don't think it's true that, for instance, you can only do, you know, biomedical science on BBC One, which was our sort of default position for sort of popular science, and you can only do sort of physics or cosmology on BBC Four, which again was our default position. And I think what we've seen is it's much more about what we're trying to do is say, actually, you can do a whole range of subject areas for different bits, different demographics, different bits of the audience. It's about the tonality, the approach, the format, perhaps to an extent, though I don't think that's the whole story. It's that even. So, for instance, on Bang Goes the Theory, we've done very popular items about sort of, you know, jet lag and cortisol. And we've also done items about dark matter and what an atom is. And similarly, we're doing things on Four that we might not have done in the past. And so we're trying to take greater advantage of that portfolio and deliver more, if you like, against the privilege of having that portfolio of channels. So I think that's the sort of the first and most important point.
That's great. Should we look at a clip, a reel of some of your programmes?
Yeah.
And you can get a sense of them.
Not quite sure what's on this clip reel. Let's have a look. Nothing.
This year, Radio 4's So You Want to Be a Scientist.
What are you going to do next?
The more worlds we study, the more we realise that our solar system is a cosmic laboratory. Even the slightest differences in size or position can create a world radically different from its neighbours.
There's a reassuring amount of gaffer tape on it.
We'll pedal as hard as we can. The chain drive that sneaks down here will turn that propeller.
Is that going to generate the amount of thrust we need to actually get us airborne?
BBC roadshows are encouraging people to get hands-on with science.
Fancy a go?
Young people have an intrinsic interest in science, but that interest tends to wane often in the teenage phase.
Why is it that you chose a career on the boards?
What I noticed was when I was doing equations, and on the rare occasion that I got one right, there was never any applause.
With this astonishing X-ray vision, we can understand the precision engineering of a top athlete.
We get along by being just good enough at a huge number of different things.
You were responsible for spotting the very first pulsar, personally, I think.
And we just got down the end of this long laboratory, and there was a strangled cry from Robin, "Here it is!" And we came charging back up the lab, and there it was, pulse, 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 pulse.
You know, where I'm heading is just so extreme, so oppressive that I'm going to need all of these people just to get there. It's going to be like visiting another planet.
Lab UK offers everyone the chance to take part in groundbreaking experiments.
So you can see a wide range there. In fact, I Googled all of your output on the panel to kind of see what the TV reviewers said about your various work. And they're quite favourable to your stuff. They said, Brian Cox is very good, not just because he's totty, with a nice soft Lancashire accent, but because he clearly feels a huge amount of love and wonder for what he does. And The Guardian goes on, it must have been a eureka moment for whoever discovered him. A line that's painful for me to read because I turned him down. Was it a eureka moment to discover Brian Cox?
Brian's someone that we've been, the BBC's been nurturing for a long time, and he's made a number of Horizons, he's done some other stuff for us, and it felt like the right time to give him a really big series to do, and this was a series that we really wanted to do. So like many things in science, it's less about, a eureka moment and more about a very painful process of sort of cumulative discovery. But I think what sort of Brian, if you like, sort of illustrates, one of the things that I think is interesting to talk about in the context of making science programs and who we're trying to reach with them, is the absolute critical importance, in my view, of presenters for science programming. And I mean, that doesn't mean that every science program has to have a presenter, but I do think there's something about science that, to bring it to a general audience, and by that I mean a BBC Two and even a BBC Four audience as much as a BBC One audience, requires an act of translation. I think modern science is, in some ways, can be dense, it can be specialist, and that act of translation that a presenter can bring to the table, not the only way you can do it, but a fundamental way, is disproportionately important in this genre compared to many others. Science isn't inherently built around stories, and that's what a presenter can bring to the table and the audience can respond to. We spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking about our presenters, a disproportionate amount of time and spend, once we're in production, on their performance. And I think that's, when it pays off, it's wonderful.
Yeah. There's something about Bang Goes the Theory. I think that, it's kind of, in a way, a replacement for Tomorrow's World. The Independent says, great to see popular science back in the 7:30 p.m. BBC One slot. Tomorrow's World for the Top Gear generation, says the Scotsman. And The Guardian says, there must be a better way, but for now it's as good as it gets.
I love The Guardian, forever damning with faint praise.
Yeah. Tell me, is that a success for you? Bang Goes the Theory brings a lot of youth audience to science?
Bang Goes the Theory was about the most nerve-wracking television experience I've ever been involved in. I can't tell you how petrified I was. I was the launch exec for that show. We really, at times, wondered if we were going to be able to pull this off. And we wanted to make it... It was really important to us that it didn't do what... I think a lot of people expected us to do, which was to make it essentially a sort of consumer-facing programme, to make it about sort of health, those sort of very, very, if you like, neat fit territories with a BBC One audience's expectations. And whether we were going to be able to do what we wanted to do, which was something very different, something that could, alongside some of that subject matter, also put things like physics or chemistry on the screen, felt, genuinely challenging, particularly with, a brand new set of presenters and a brand new set and all of those things. And I think we've done it. We started with, 2.5 million. We hit 4 million this autumn. The feedback I've had from the science community is, when they've sat down and watched it, actually genuine surprise at the amount of real science content that there is in that show, and a sort of actually even a couple of quite eminent people in the science community saying, do you think there's too much science content in there? Which is it's probably a better response than there's too little. It's got a long way to go. We're trying to do something extraordinary, which is grow a set of people that the audience trust with that content, and we want to do that over a long period of time.
Would it be fair to say that your science output is quite unashamedly science? I mean, last year you called the Year of Science on the BBC. You have science in the title of your programmes, which is unheard of on the Channel 4, the story of science. You're not really embarrassed about doing science, are you?
I'm not. I think
you don't smuggle it in, though. You don't.
No.
Does that mean that you maybe don't reach audiences who maybe the Wellcome Trust are concerned about trying to get through to audiences who wouldn't necessarily come to a science programme?
Well, it's that's a very, very fair question to ask, because I think you're absolutely right. We're not embarrassed about doing science, and in fact, we're proud to do it. I think the answer to that, we're doing a lot of drilling into sort of audience data at the moment. I think the answer to that is no. Science skews younger, for instance, for BBC Two than any other factual genre. On BBC One, we're reaching demographics with programmes like Jimmy's Food Factory, The Young Ones, Bang, that wouldn't just self-describe as science audiences. Sure. So I think the answer is no, but clearly an answer we need to keep asking. The fact that we're not ashamed of science doesn't mean that we're not interested in doing it in unexpected ways. So something like The Young Ones, I think, did read differently to the audience, I was really, really proud to do it for its warmth, its relevance to the audience, its sort of sense of Britishness. And there are other things that we've got coming down the tracks that I think won't read like Horizon or Solar System or Chemistry of Volatile History or even Bang. But fundamentally, no, I think there's a big audience out there which are curious. They have an appetite for information about the world. They may not self-describe as, science interested, but the sort of fundamental values of science programming, they're very open to.
Okay, well, that's clear. I think that sets out your stall nicely. The barman in my local pub knows that I'm something to do with science television. And after a hard day's work, when I go there, he goes, "I love that Brian Cox of yours." And I go, fuck, anyway, let's move on. Kate Techman has a different vision of getting science onto television. And it's not your specialist subject. No. Could you tee up your clips before we shock the audience with your clips? Maybe you could give a bit of a vision about how you see science in your world.
Well, I suppose in our world, we don't make science programmes, because David makes science programmes. But when I came to put the reel together, and anyway, just by meeting people and talking about programme ideas, science is really important to features. And so when I was putting the reel together, the amount of science, as I see it, in its broadest, very, very broad terms, was in probably 2/3 of all our programmes. So obviously embarrassing bodies, it's medicine, sort of as you said, it's a neat fit. But we do really try and push the science. The clips that you'll see I'll go into anyway, but sort of like, from grand design, sex education, how clean is your house, with Kim and Aggie and their little experiments. We do, and I think, as you'll probably see, or hopefully you'll see on the clip reel, and I think it's because we make factual sort of programmes for as wide an audience as possible, or at least we try, and we're always trying to answer the question why, and science does that really rather well, and it makes for, I think, really good television programmes. So introducing the clips that you're about to see, you're going to see sort of 3 different experiments, which I've rather crudely, not coming from any science background, labelled up as biology, because you've got an embarrassing bodies clip. Physics, because we've got a help, my house is falling down, where we brought science quite purposefully into a property show, where instead of sort of looking at buying property and selling property, we looked at trying to maintain your property, and that came into all the kind of structure of a house, which is actually really rather scientific. So you're going to see a clip about subsidence. And then you're going to see a clip done by a colleague, which is Heston, who obviously is sort of the chemist in the kitchen. And we think that brings a really broad and entertaining way of looking at experiments.
Well, should we have a look at those clips? Maybe we should say some viewers may find the following scenes disturbing. Do we normally say that when we broadcast it?
We do say that to get probably
to get people to get them in more numbers. Let's have a.
You might be surprised to learn that the average size for the soft penis is about 3.5 inches, nearly 9 centimetres, whilst the erect willy is 5.5 inches, or 14 centimetres. Dr. Christian is going to conduct the showers or growers experiment. Do some men have big willies when they're floppy, the showers, while others, the growers, have a lot of length when erect?
I'm going to put some gloves on. Right, so this is what I want you to do. Floppy willy, obviously, just hold your t-shirt up a little bit. You go from the top, okay? And that does not mean there or there. It means from there, basically, yeah? From where the angle forms between the penis and the pelvis there. So you go from there, and you just run it all the way down to the very end and mark it like that. It may help you if you pick it up and hold it at right angles. You get more of a right angle, and you do it from exactly where abdomen comes down and his willy comes out, okay? You're also going to cheat at this, aren't you? I think you have been pretty honest, actually. What you can see, blue is floppy, flaccid length, and red is erect length. And the thing that excites me most is this whole shower and grower thing, because that was the point of all this. You see this guy down here? He's 3 inches when he's floppy. Where do you think he is when he's erect?
7.5.
Exactly. He goes to 7 inches when erect. That's a 135% increase in size. If we take our largest guy here, floppy, at 5.5 inches, he's only half an inch bigger when he's erect. So it's absolutely proved the point about shows and growth. So I think if you have a little willy when it's floppy, usually you can hold your head up high.
I'm afraid the trees coming down, though, aren't the end of the story.
It's the end of some problems. It's also the beginning of some new problems. If you imagine the ground as this sponge, what's happened is that the trees have drunk all the water and it's just got smaller and smaller and smaller, like this. And now the ground is at this size instead of the size it normally would be. This represents the dehydrated soil. This is dried out sponges. This represents your house, a brick sitting on top. As it rains, the ground will rehydrate. So this is what will end up happening to your house. And as you can see from this, where it moved in one direction before, it'll move in the other direction this time. And so you're going to have considerable movement, and that is going to go on for possibly 4 or 5 years. It's called heave when you rehydrate the land, and it's a significant amount that this house will move.
At the end of the day, it's eventually going to stop.
Yeah, it'll get to its height, won't it, then stop?
It will, but it's going to be a long...
I mean, we tend to be here for more than that anyway, so...
At least we've got an house still.
Yeah. I mean,
even with the fuel cracks again.
We're mixing mint sweets with a fizzy drink, which creates a rapid release of carbon dioxide.
We'll get these Mentos in a bottle of Diet Coke, and we haven't got very long from once you put them in till it starts frothing.
Mischievous kids all over the world have discovered the rough surface of the sweets creates massive bubble growth in the drink, causing it to fountain up.
We're going to start with a couple, just in case. Okay, anyone close to these, goggles on, please.
Now I'm adopting the principles from the first explosion, but using dry ice and water instead to rapidly release carbon dioxide.
The bottle with the dry ice, I'm going to very delicately insert it into the cake. Oh, look at that. Would you look at that? Hang on a second. Lid on. Right, we've got to get behind the car. Look at it. Quick. Oh, get in there!
That's biology, physics and chemistry from our features department. Let's start with embarrassing illnesses and embarrassing bodies.
Yes.
You divided The Guardian. One reviewer said, embarrassing illnesses is a kind-hearted, inspiring and hopeful, with a warts-and-all approach that may encourage viewers to seek treatment for bowel cancer rather than dying of shame. Whereas the other Guardian reviewer said, if I'd wanted to look up people's arses, I'd have become an arse doctor. The most disturbing thing I've ever seen on television. Is it voyeuristic? Is it justifiable? I mean,
I think it's totally justifiable. Is it voyeuristic? Well, it is. I think it's a pleasure to view, and there are obviously there's a lot of shocking content. The shocking content, people either go because they want to know about their medical problem, or they want to see the shocking problem, the content. They'll come out, hopefully armed with all sorts of knowledge that they might not have gone in for that reason, and I think that works. It's got a very, it's got such a broad reach. It does incredibly well for us. It's sort of upwards of 3.5 million.
No, it's a massive audience winner, but isn't it quite a low-level pleasure looking at someone else's genital warts? I mean,
not for 3.5 million people, David. Is it? I don't think it is. I think it's. When have you ever seen them before? Where do you get the opportunity?
I haven't. No, you've got me there.
And personal question.
Moving swiftly on. That property programme, that's not science, is it? I mean, Heston is not science. No kid's going to pass an exam in science having watched your output, are they? Come on.
We see, I come from a different place because I am the person that didn't think science was cool, and now I love it in everything, wherever it manifests itself. I embrace it and encourage it and would love it because I think that is it. And that might be the problem, is what I think is science, other people might not. But I definitely think that's, for someone with subsidence, when I saw that clip, when I saw that programme, I was enchanted by the fact that something that I'd imagined was so terrible and so great was so simple and logical, and it never crossed my mind because I'm not a scientist. And so for me, that is science.
There's no doubt that you bring science to audiences that wouldn't necessarily watch the more straight documentaries that perhaps some of the rest of us are involved in. Let me talk about one. I mean, is there any limit to how far you'll go? There's a forthcoming commission of yours, I believe, called Beauty and the Beast, where facially disfigured people live with models. Is that right? Beauty and the Beast. Can you tell us a bit about that?
What papers have you been reading, David? Beauty and the Beast is a programme that is coming up, and it is core PSB for us, like Embarrassing Bodies, like Sex Education Show, a programme where we look at our obsession with beauty and the beast that is prejudice. And therefore, we are taking the experience and asking people with facial disfigurement to help out in what is a universal, but we believe is an increasingly universal problem of beauty obsession, and therefore to hear their point of view. So in sort of, if you want to be crude, it is two people. One has a facial disfigurement, one has another relationship, quite extreme relationship to beauty products. But it's core PSB.
Do you ever think this is pushing the boundaries of taste? Do you ever turn anything down on those grounds? Do you ever think this scene is too much, or do you just say,
yes,
bring it on? You do?
Yes.
Can you give us an example?
I can give you an example of something I did this week, for example, which there's no reason to do it, but I felt it was undignified, and therefore I wouldn't want to go. It's quite hard to say. It's to do with, and it's not to do with Beauty and the Beast at all. It's to do with a health clip, and I did think it pushed. I mean, other people thought it was amazing. I thought it pushed the boundaries of taste, and I could be wrong. But yes, so I would.
Call.
It's a pure judgment call, but we're there to push boundaries, and if that gets people, but it isn't we'll do anything to shock. That would be ridiculous.
And just to be serious for a second, embarrassing illnesses and embarrassing bodies, it has a claim to have saved lives, doesn't it?
Yes, it has.
Can you tell the audience just a couple of...
I mean, on general, we get letters and emails regularly when the programme's on from people who have found lumps, and so we always think, how many times can you do breast examinations again, mass breast tests? How many times can you do testicular examinations? But every time we do it, someone comes forward that has found it. So it's almost like you can't do it enough. You can't do those tests on intimate parts of your body enough. But we've also obviously it's quite well known that we had a case of a child who came with a terrible case of verrucas called Charlotte. And she saw Dr. Christian, and Dr. Christian recognised that she had symptoms. They'd been trying to treat them for 5 years. It was almost like another foot had grown with the verrucas, and he wanted her to have a test on her immune system. And the test on the immune system led to the fact that she had a rare problem, which led to her going to Great Ormond Street and having a bone marrow transplant, which, hopefully, if Charlotte's right, which has led to helping save her life. So in those things, that's very specific, and we made a documentary about it. But I think on a broader thing, we get people to go to the doctor, and we get people to test at home, and we get men to go to the doctor, and that's been a major challenge for a long, long time with the NHS. And so we're very, very proud of that.
One last question. Why do people go on it? If their illness and body is so embarrassing, why show it to the nation? Why
that's the age-old question. That's the sort of riddle of the sphincter, isn't it? But it's the...
the riddle of the sphincter.
People do it because, from what we know, and I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons people do it, and some... But...
Go on, what are the reasons?
Well, one is because they've been trying to get treated for a long time and they haven't had an answer.
Right.
Charlotte was like years with these verrucas, and then, we treated them. That for some reason they trust our doctors more than their own GP, or they somehow believe going to our doctors is, by the very public nature of it, that they, rather than going to their GP, they find that more comforting, which is probably quite difficult to understand. And also, some people want to go and show what their condition, because they genuinely have an altruistic motive to share that, to sort of, the mantra of the show is have no shame, all the same, and they really want other people to see that.
Right.
And so that is genuine. So there is quite a lot of altruism. There's also people, they really are desperate to find out what's wrong with them, and they trust our doctors.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on. That's very clear. David Jugan, do you want to say anything about your strategy for interesting millions of people in science, or introduce your clips? What's your strategy? How do you differ from the two people we've heard from so far?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I do have a bit more confidence in science, which is probably misplaced. I don't know, because I know certainly whenever we try and sell stuff to you, you start almost from the opposite sort of perspective. And
Should we show the clip? I mean, no need to go here.
But I think, I mean, obviously we're very aware that to get something on Channel 4, it has to shake things up a bit. It has to have something which is going to sort of slightly make them nervous. I mean, they seem to enjoy being on a knife edge, and probably more than I do. But if that's what you've got to do, then we do.
I like seeing you on a knife edge, David. I don't like being on a knife edge.
And we had a very nail-biting year last year. I mean, we did 3 things, all of which kept Channel 4 compliance department very busy. One was about race and intelligence. One was about doing surgery live, including an operation on someone who was conscious while they were having their brain operated on, and a live heart valve replacement operation. That was done, in fact, in collaboration with the Wellcome Trust. And I know that they were certainly biting their nails all the way down, I think, throughout that first night of the live surgery. And then there was also Inside Nature's Giants, which is, you know, cutting up dead animals to uncover their evolutionary history. Now, for me, those are clear ideas and interesting on all sorts of levels. And the fact that they shock is kind of secondary. But it did mean that they got commissioned. And luckily, we all seem to have escaped with our lives. So
right, let's roll the clips and then we'll talk about it. Let's see some of these. Again, if we're going to say surgery, some clips that some viewers may find disturbing. Let's have a bit of this.
Okay, so another squid, lunch comes along, touches the end of these. Are these so sensitive that as soon as they get touched by anything, they'll just go around the animal here? And these suckers can we feel it? Can they actually still stick to anything?
If you take it, yeah, they probably are. That's.
Yeah.
Look at that.
You've still got.
And each one of those has also got that circular saw-like ring all around it. That's just going to latch onto the soft-bodied squid. There's just no escape.
And then the whole body then comes.
Should we do it?
Yep.
Down we go, and the arms will splay, and it'll come over.
Got you.
Got me.
And those will open up, and they'll restrain the squid.
And that's just all pulled towards
the business end.
The business end, into the beak, dispatched.
Done.
That's amazing.
So when the giraffe is holding its head like that, absolutely no effort whatsoever to do so. But when it wants to drink, then it contracts all of these muscles and has to bend that ligament. Now that is impressive. If we try to bend that head, now grab it, Mark, and see if you can pull it towards Joy and see how much you managed to get it. Keep pulling.
No, I'm not coming your way. Yeah, I've got it.
Got to go a little further if you're going to put it on. Whoops.
Well, you're going to have to.
And then let it go.
You can't move that.
Let it go and see where it goes.
Whoa!
Exactly. And that's exactly what happens. And when it stops drinking, that is 2 seconds for the head to swing through a 4-meter arc, and it's all dependent on the tension in that ligament.
I'm setting out on a journey into dangerous territory. Not a physical place, but an idea. At its heart is a question so radioactive that it's only usually raised in public by political extremists. And the question is there a racial pecking order in intelligence in which black people are less clever than white people? It seems unbelievable to be asking it in the 21st century. And yet, it is a question that still finds its way even into lecture halls and scientific literature.
So we need
need to do some speech tasks now. Is he okay for talking now?
Yeah. Now, Peter, can you hear me?
Okay.
Good. Well, I want you to do some counting. Okay, nice and slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Loud as you can.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
A bit louder.
4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20.
Okay, and from 1 again.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30.
Okay, relax.
Shoot the forceps. Do 4 milliamps, thanks.
Okay.
So, David, I mean, in the 1980s, you used to make kind of very solid BBC horizons. Now it must seem like you kind of run an exotic butcher's shop. Have you sold out?
Exotic butchers. Well, you know, I think if it was just exotic butchery, the Inside Nature's Giants, I don't think people would come back to it. I mean, for me, it might be slightly exotic, but those programs have a huge amount of content in them, and they are actually about evolution. They're about physiology. They're actually packed with science. And I think if it was just a kind of Gunther von Hagen fest where you're kind of doing all that where it's the thrill of the blood and the gore, then people wouldn't come back to it. I mean, I speak as someone who is very squeamish and doesn't particularly like blood and gore. I remember the first time I went into the Royal Veterinary College and saw 2 dead horses in a giant fridge and came out, I thought, oh my God, I don't think we're going to be able to do this. It's just horrible. And one of the first dissections we did with a lion and a tiger alongside, and they skinned the animals. And these 2 creatures with their skins off looked absolutely, unbelievably gross. And I just thought, God, what have we done? Perhaps we have done an exotic butcher's shop. But you see, what happened then was that I managed to get over this by being with those people, being with those comparative anatomists, seeing those people who are so enthusiastic about carefully dissecting everything out and working things out and working out puzzles and tracing why it is that the digestive tract in a giant squid goes to the middle of its brain, and everyone is sort of looking at this thing going, God, yeah, that is interesting, and that, you see, if you can get past the kind of the gore barrier, then it becomes something that is totally engrossing for me, and I think possibly for the audience too.
Are you going to run out of giants? That's one of the questions. Like, why do people go on embarrassing illnesses? People ask, are you going to run out of giants? How are you going to keep on? Are we going to get ever smaller animals? Are you going to be dissecting a turkey soon?
You'd be surprised how interesting the inside of a giant cockroach is. No, there'll be plenty more. I mean, I think you can look at other things. I mean, so definitely. I don't think so. If you take something, I think there's a way of looking at something like a tree in the jungle, and actually piecing that together and looking at some of the insect life in it and pulling all that stuff apart. I mean, so I feel it's more now. What's interesting is that having been about 8 of these shows, in a way, it's not the size matters less, if you see what I mean. I think the process that you go through with this group of people. With Joy Reidenberg, who's this amazing lady who jumps inside whales and has just done the same inside a hippo, and she for the next series. I mean, it's just being with those people and seeing their enthusiasm. I think it'll still work, and there are plenty of animals out there.
Let's talk about Surgery Live. I mean, you wouldn't guess it from that rather boring clip of someone half asleep counting to 10. But it was quite a wild programme. But was it voyeuristic? Was it really necessary to do it live? I mean, what if someone had died?
Well, we had, as you know, incredible contingency plans for that eventuality that were very well worked out in advance. There was sort of emergency strategy. Strategy 1 was, if
It was cut to The Simpsons, wasn't it?
No, that was the last. That was the last.
That was the last resort. That was what I remember.
Yeah, there were ones before that where you handed over to the surgeon in the studio and various other things. I think what was interesting, and it's interesting that that clip was so boring, and I'm glad we showed that, the really boring clip, because it doesn't look very much now as you see it. But I can tell you, on the night, if you were actually tuned in at 11 o'clock and you'd seen that cranium opened up, and you'd seen him talking to him and he's still conscious, if you'd seen the surgeon suddenly realising as he's operating on a heart valve that actually something isn't quite right and the programme had to run on an extra half hour, that is an adrenaline rush which you are experiencing via the surgeon. And I can just tell you from the twittering and all the Facebook and stuff, all the other sort of multi-platform stuff that went on, that there was an audience engaged in that show. I mean, it got over 1 million people very late at night, going on in, past midnight, this show. And you could just tell people were engaged in it. Now, that doesn't look like much now, but if you're there and you're aware that someone on the other side of London is actually having this operation done, and you just put yourself in the position of the surgeons and the people doing that operation. I don't think you get that sensation from something like Your Life in Their Hands. It's a much more measured, thought-out thing. Very good in its own way, and if you're doing technical surgery, good. But you don't get that sort of visceral experience.
And we got, as you say, almost 1 million viewers, Kim and Kate. We shouldn't probably boast too much about our viewing figures, David, compared to the current panel. Let's go on to Steve. Can we show a clip of you in action, Steve, before we hear what you've got to say about these TV people's attempt to turn science into television? Let's see a little sort of Steve on television before we come to him.
So how do I test these claims? Rushton's a psychologist. I think it's time I heard about the genetics of race and intelligence from an actual geneticist. I want to take up Rushton's arguments one by one with Steve Jones, Professor of Genetics at University College London.
Is it possible to arrive at a biological definition of race that would be acceptable to people in your field?
It's obviously true that there are geographic differences in the human population. That's obviously the case. You look at you and look at me. I mean, we look different. But if we were to look beneath the skin, there wouldn't be a complete split. So actually, the human race is remarkable compared to other primates in only one way. It's so boring. We're so similar to each other from place to place.
This is important. According to Jones, there are genetic differences between races, but they're not very big. What strikes him is how alike we are, which suggests environmental factors play a key role in IQ.
But at the same time, I mean, on the other side of the argument, one can't deny that there is hereditary components in IQ.
Oh no, I think it'd be extremely foolish to deny that there's a hereditary component in intelligence. It's extremely foolish to deny there's a hereditary component in almost anything. You know, most things have some heritability, as we say. You will probably someday find a few of the genes that underlie some of that heritability. But what that'll tell you about race and IQ, I have no idea. I would imagine almost nothing.
So there you are, on the television in one of David's programmes. Tell me, what do you make of what you've heard from the panellists today about their different approaches?
I think it's very interesting. I mean, it's clear, without causing anybody's ears to go red, that we're clearly in a golden age of science broadcasting. It goes back a long way. I mean, I think what a lot of people in broadcasting don't realise is what an enormous influence they have on the world of science, particularly from the point of view of students. It's a rather alarming fact to discover that each year, going into British universities, there are more students going to study forensic science than there are forensic scientists in Britain, okay? And that's because of crime scene, CSI and that kind of stuff. So you do wield a fairly powerful weapon here. And in general, I think it's all extremely impressive. One thing which does slightly concern me, and I've talked to a lot of people about this recently, is that what science on television fails to reflect is what you might think of as the culture of science. When I start my first year genetics lectures, I stand up and with a straight face, I tell them the truth. I say, I'm a geneticist, and my job is to make sex boring. And they all look at me blankly, and after 24 lectures, they sure as hell know what I mean. And that's a slight issue, you know. I mean, it's very easy to pick the cherries out of the cake and not have, you know, the flour and the sugar and the actual
What do you mean, what's this issue? Let's get to the heart of it. So what's the problem?
It's an issue that it makes science look more palatable than it is. You know, I'm one of the world's... it's an old joke. I'm one of the world's top 6 experts on the genetics of snails, and the other 5 agree, okay? But to reach that elevated position, I've been working on them now for 40 years, and I've collected something like 400,000 of them, and I've spent more or less 2 complete years in a tent doing that, okay? And it was all very boring at the end. I mean, there's no television program in it. But that's part of, if you're going to be a scientist, if you're going to understand science, you've got to realize there's a huge amount of grinding, painful, hard work to get to the summits. It's like doing the ascent of Everest and only showing the flag on the top. And I think that's one thing which you slightly miss.
Is there anything that can be done about that? Kim, how about showing the laborious grind of science to your audience? Do you think he's got a point there? Or is there anything that can be done about that? We're supposed to make it interesting, aren't we?
Natural obstock territory, I don't think. I mean, it's a point that I think we're acutely aware of, which is process in science involves a timescale that's completely different to process in so many other areas of human endeavour. And that's a real problem, because there are... One often contemplates things that have got an obstock flavour, or where you would like to follow sort of process through, and it's just, frankly, it's impossible, both logistically and editorially. Fundamentally, I am a television programme maker rather than a scientist or a science communicator, and my primary responsibility is to entertain and inform the British audience, and that will always be paramount in the decisions I make about what programmes to commission. I think that there are interesting and, you know, questions that we haven't answered about, are there other ways that we could get closer to reflecting that culture? I mean, when we did something like Beautiful Minds on BBC 4, it was definitely in our mind that we would attempt through those portraits of working scientists to get a little closer to some of the things that
And Michael Mosley's story of science, to some extent, I think tells a real picture, or tries to do a real picture of kind of the stories. But I mean, you see our problem, don't you?
Oh, sure. I think that's true. But I think you, even seeing the problem is obviously there, I still do think that there is a slightly misleading impression given that science is like an endless cocktail party. You know, it's nothing but... You know, I've worked in labs for many years, and I've never once heard the word breakthrough. That could be the lab I work in, of course. But that's simply true. And I think you have to nod at that fact. And to become, you know, I remember when I was as an undergraduate student in Edinburgh, we dissected a lion. We walked in, there was this bloody lion. And we thought, oh, God. And then somebody said brightly, at least we know it won't be in the exam, right? So, but that was one of, what, 100, 150 different species a zoology student would dissect. So I think there is something in that difficulty, really. Another thing which actually, part of this BBC thing I'm doing, there's a whole new science of science, which is called scientometrics, which I suppose in the end is rather boring, but as I'm sure everybody knows, the whole of the scientific literature is now electronic. Paper, forget it, we don't use paper anymore. And it's searchable using extraordinary machine called the Web of Science, which nobody in the media seems to have heard of, I have to say, but that's a separate issue. But what that means is that if you're a sort of statistician, you could look at the elephant, which is science, the whole thing. How many papers on this subject, this subject, this subject, this subject? Who working on this refers to that? Is there a recent burst in this versus a decline in that? So there's all this massive information out there, which is kind of specialised and not much general interest, except that you realise, and I hadn't really realised until I started looking at it, that the media are the blind man feeling the elephant, and they've got the tip of the trunk. You know, you've got the obvious things. Now, inevitably, you're going to have the solar system, and it's wonderful. You're going to have the universe, and it's one Big Bang, and it's wonderful. You're going to have evolution, and it's wonderful. But the biggest single publication stream in Britain is on drug design. Now, when was the last time you saw drug design on television? Now, clearly, it's not easy to do, but it would be interesting at least to make a try.
That's an interesting point. Let me... Yeah, I mean, what do you say to that, Kate and Kim? Any views on that? Could you do anything on, say, drug design? Do we just go for the kind of the sexy tip of science rather than the?
Well,
you certainly
we are trying.
Give me the sexy tip.
Interesting. We're trying at the moment to do something longitudinal on not exactly drug design, but on drug testing over sort of several years, and we'll see whether that could be complete absolute fucking disaster, or it could be really, really compelling television. We'll see how it comes out when we reconvene in sort of 18 months' time. I think that it's right to, I'm not sure that I'm very optimistic about what we'll do about it, but I think it's right to acknowledge the fact that, storytelling demands, which is what we do on television, demands a sort of, an editing process. Get me to the exciting moments. And that fights, that fights science. And I think, we certainly are trying to make, for instance, our historical science narratives a little more sophisticated, a little less sort of a jump from one eureka moment to another. And I think perhaps we've been sort of fallible in that respect in the past, and it's a sort of valid criticism. But at the end of the day, it is about... I also think that it's an interesting thing to say we should be making science more boring. I actually think that science in lots of ways... there are more people practicing science who are incredibly excited about it than I think that sort of quite acknowledges. And it's fascinating. There was Horizon on the other day about the origins of the Big Bang, and they filmed in something called the Perimeter Institute in Canada. And one of the most amazing things about that program was a number of actuality sequences that were filmed with just all these scientists sort of sitting around talking about the origins of the Big Bang. They were all incredibly engaged, young, quite funky-looking people in sort of quite cool T-shirts, and that's what they spent their time thinking about, and they were really, really excited. And I think if we can capture some of that on television, that's probably the road I would go down in terms of getting closer to putting science process on screen than perhaps, Steve, what you're thinking of.
What do you think, Kate?
Well, obviously the drug test sort of does lend itself quite easily sort of to our world in certain ways, whether it's consumer interface or however. But I think, and this probably isn't my world, but I do think that I'd love to know what's going on in labs, or what almost in a grand design kind of sense, what people are working towards. So instead of having to get there at the sexy tip, if we sort of were at the working shaft, we might, in a way, be quite interested to see, because it's these things that might end up with nothing, but what people are trying to do, I think, is really, really interesting. So that, to get in a different part of the process.
Cool. Well, in a little while, we're going to ask for your questions. So think of some questions. You can grill this panel in just a few minutes. But first, we're going to just try out something that was suggested by the Wellcome Trust, which is that Steve's going to outline a little bit of the genetics world that he knows. And then we're going to put these three brains onto how they would turn it into fascinating television. And then we'll see which he's happiest with. So that's the plan. Steve, do you want to kind of pitch your science? Please don't make it interesting. No concessions to interest. As dry as you can, please. And then we'll see what these three do to it.
I can only lecture in 50-minute chunks, so prepare yourselves. After I've told my first-year students that I'm going to make their sex lives boring, I say, look to the person to your left and the person to your right. You might like to do that. And they look a bit bemused, and I say, 2 out of the 3 of you will die for reasons connected to the genes you carry. They look a bit glum at that. And then I say, cheer up. If I'd been giving this lecture in Shakespeare's time, 2 out of every 3 of you would be dead already. And that's clearly true. We're in an extraordinary period of human existence, where in Shakespeare's time, 2/3 of all English babies were dead before they were 21. In Darwin's time, half of them were dead before they were 21. And now 99% of them are alive when they're 21. Okay? However, they all have to die in the end. So we used to die from the enemy that came from outside, and very appropriately here in Sheffield. Now, or some people believe now, we die from the enemy within. Okay? The enemy within, of course, being the famous double helix, which has been sequenced, and the rate of progress at doing that is completely mind-blasting. It took 15 years and probably 1,000 scientists to do the first human DNA sequence. Now people are seriously talking about doing the whole thing in 15 minutes with one scientist and a machine that goes ping. So we're really on an era where we're going to be able to disentangle what makes us what we are in the banal anatomical sense we saw with that dissecting nature's giants. We're now doing it on a minute scale. All we're doing with DNA is what you saw those anatomists doing with scalpels, but on a much smaller scale. And the interesting question is, which nobody's ever really approached on television, or even in general, I don't think, is how much is that going to tell us? And I have to say, in my specialist mode of making life tedious, probably less than you think for most people. It turns out that actually the search for the genes that cause this kind of that cause illness has, with few exceptions, been really a bit of a will o' the wisp. You would never think that. If you look at any newspaper on any day, you will see a statement: scientists find the gene for. You may have seen liberalism last week, okay? Scientists find the gene for liberalism. I see no sign of it, I have to say. But I typed it into Google, scientists find the gene for. I got 63,000 hits. Liberalism, depression, happiness, stuttering, musicality, and premature ejaculation were all in the first 10. I can understand most of them. Premature ejaculation, why that's still around. If it's genetic, I don't know. But the central point is that actually, for geneticists, unlike the media, the more you know about genes, the more important the environment seems. People are scared of having their DNA scanned, okay, because you might tell them, for example, you are going to die on the 27th of April, 2014 of a brain hemorrhage. If you walk into your doctor's surgery, he or she can tell you immediately with 80% accuracy when you're going to die. It takes almost no time. This is banal. We know this. First of all, how old are you? Okay, I'm much older than most people in this room, so I'm probably going to die sooner. Are you male or female? Males die young, females die older. Do you smoke? What's your postcode? There's a 15-year difference in life expectancy in the richest and the poorest postcode in Britain. And all these things we know and we accept. But because they're in the DNA, because it's molecular biology, somehow it's something new and startling. And I'd like to see if it were possible to make a program that takes a holistic view of people's fate. That race and intelligence one being absolutely classic. Raggy Omar jokingly said to me after he'd interviewed me, of course, this is, when it comes to intelligent Africans, we really mean Somalis, don't we? Which was a funny joke, but that simply tells you that in people's mind is this belief that actually, whether you want to believe it or not, it's all in the genes. It's not. And I'd like to see somebody make a program about it.
Well, let's see how these three... I'm not going to take part in this because I'm chairing it. I'll just say it sounds like a one-off to me, and we're not doing a lot of one-offs at the moment. But
I think it sounds like an embarrassing illnesses special on premature ejaculation.
Well, let's start with you, Kim. How would you turn that into television?
Well, you know, I'm not sure that I would, not because it's not worthy of being turned into television, but I think that we make an awful lot of programmes that wrestle, some successfully, some not, with that boundary between, you know, crudely nature and nurture, environment and genetics.
Could you give some examples of the kinds of things?
So the kind of things that I think that we've made, and like I say, some successfully, some not. I think Child of Our Time does that for one audience. I think The Incredible Human Journey with Alice Roberts looked at the way genetics was rewriting our understanding of human origins and threw up some really interesting questions about the similarity of the genome underneath sort of racial differences and the extent to which, you know, differences in skin tone were produced by environmental conditions and so forth. I think that absolutely kind of touched on this territory. I think that I made a programme not that long ago where a series of celebrities, including John Barrowman, went in search of answers about themselves, the making of me. And John Barrowman, for instance, wanted to find out what was the scientific understanding of why he was gay. And in that journey, took in genetics, which is, you know, astonishingly sort of complex and inconclusive on the question of sort of sexual preference. He took in hormonal influences in the womb. He took in psychology and upbringing. I mean, it was a very, very rich journey. It was also very funny and quite playful. Things that I think are really
okay, that's clear. So, Steve, I mean, in a way, this is already on the BBC. We've got Child of Our Time. We've got, you know, John Barrowman, Am I Gay? We've got Alice Roberts. We're doing this anyway. There's no need for your programme.
I think that's
on the BBC.
That's a fair comment. But it's still strikingly the case that the great mass of the British public, or the world's public, does not believe that. Mm-hmm. There's a classic case of this a couple of weeks ago, where there was a report which came out in the Today programme, it was widely publicised, that simply said ADHD is genetic. And those three words, you know, any geneticist could spend an hour disentangling what that means. The next day, the Daily Mail, in its noble fashion, had a whole-page piece. It was headed, Bad Seed Kids. Okay, bad seed kids, what are they talking about? In other words, your kid's got a gene for ADHD. Whatever you do will not improve its prospects. And this was a whole page of rant about some people are inferior and impossible to treat because of the way they were born. Now, this is, to somebody in my trade, this is a constant drizzle of trying to fight this back. And yet we don't succeed. Okay, well let's see if we can get another offering. Kate Dickman, how would you tackle the idea that genetic determinism is overstated?
Overstated?
Well, you're saying you're going to swing away what you're saying, but how would you do genes and genetics then in features? Just let's do that first.
Probably by overstating. We have just recently. We did. We're doing embarrassing fat bodies. And
embarrassing fat bodies?
We did the fat gene, and these people just...
The fat gene?
Yeah, and these people realised that they were...
So we've done the fat gene on Channel 4,
no,
Steve, you'll be glad to hear.
It's 12
we've just got 4,000 more genes to get through.
And the fat family realised that they actually had a very low risk and they just ate too much.
But I mean, that's a classic... There we go, so we've done it too. That's a classic case. Now, I lecture about obesity. It's a classic of genetics. It's highly heritable. And I show a picture of this two very overweight American parents and their very overweight daughter. And I say, well, this is obviously runs in the family here. Then I show, my next slide is a picture of their cat. And their cat is like this. Okay? And they don't share genes. I know they don't share genes with their cat.
How do you know?
And so,
If
they did, though, that would be a classic program for you.
No. We make that too.
We'd all make that.
Don't think I haven't
and
thought.
Dugan would dissect it. And you can inherit an environment as much as you can inherit a gene. And there is no fat gene. There is one gene just come out about a year ago now called FTO, which bizarrely causes fused toes in mice. That's why it's called FTO. And it causes, if you've got two copies of one letter, the A, in a particular place, versus two copies of the other letter, the T, in a different place, you will weigh 5 kilograms more on average. The AAs than the TTs. And that's quite a lot, okay? Now, it's clearly the case that there's a wave of lard that has crossed the Atlantic, a tsunami of fat, which has landed and splashed. We see it around us, not in this room, of course, which has landed and splashed on the shores of Britain. And we're in an extraordinary period of time where, with few exceptions, the rich are thin. Sorry, the rich are thin and the poor are fat. That was the other way. It used to be the other way around. The reason for the obesity is nothing to do with the FTO gene. It's to do with cheap food. So in the end, once again, the idea of a fat gene really doesn't make much sense.
This is sounding more like it, though, Kate, isn't it? A tsunami of fat that's crossed the ocean.
Made it.
So you've already done it. David, how would you turn what Steve's talking about into science television?
Well, this is a kind of fusion of two ideas that I've had. I'm actually sort of thinking about this anyway. So here's what I would begin with. 2 mice, okay? One's quite large and brown and furry, and the other one is very thin. And the narration goes something like this. These mice are genetically identical. They're clones. Bit weird. For the whole of their life, they've eaten exactly the same amount of food. Bit weird. They grew as little, as baby mice, as embryos, in different mothers' wombs. And those 2 mothers were fed different things, and the result is 2 genetically identical mice, but absolutely massively different. Now, what's fascinating about this is I just think just that fact lights me up. And you think, wow. Now, this is a whole area of science called epigenetics, which now I won't go into, but I mean, it is a really interesting area. And you don't have to call it epigenetics. You just have to say, well, so it's not that, it's not what you eat, it's not what you inherit, it's what your mother might have eaten during pregnancy. Now, that's a pretty amazing idea. Okay, now, can I just carry on? Because that isn't enough. That isn't enough for this idea. Because, 2 mice, where are you going to go with that? Now we come to the interesting bit. The person that's in charge of doing this research is let's put it this way, is slightly obese, and she's married to someone slightly obese. They're both incredibly intelligent people, one is a moral philosopher, one is a neuroscientist. They gave birth to several children, and I won't go into their entire history, but I actually interviewed these two children when they were 8 and 12 as part of a thing about genetic engineering in a film called Brave New Babies. The 12-year-old, as it turned out, later on in life, very sadly, developed schizophrenia when he was about 16. He smoked a hell of a lot of dope. Was that the reason? Who knows? The 8-year-old went on to become a commissioning editor of science at Channel 4. He's sitting on my right. Now here is a family that has been through a hell of a lot. And is it genetic? Is it epigenetic? What is it? That's the film I want to make one day.
Are we discussing why I'm fat?
Can I add one more point to that narrative?
Go on, add it, fire away, chip in. What do you think?
In the journal Nature a couple of weeks ago, there was a quite amazing and almost unbelievable scientific paper. You talked about the obese mother of an obese mouse, and that's certainly true. You can pass on obesity simply through the placenta and by imprinting and so on. It turns out that if you have an obese father, that also increases the extent of obesity in the child. Not because of the genes of the father, but because the father's eaten too much. So we have now, the whole boundary between nature and nurture is breaking down. They don't mean anything anymore. People used to think of them, nature and nurture, as being like a cake. You know what I mean? A big cake with lots of marzipan on the top, which you can slice into a bit that's nature and a bit that's nurture. You can't. You have to unbake the cake. And that's really what genetics has come to. It's gone complete circle. It started off with peas, and it's ended up with pea soup.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't get commissioned anyway, Dugan's version of that.
So can I just add in a sort of popular sense? One thing I picked up, which probably people have done, I know there was a big American star who's done it, and I can't remember who it was, but is there nothing in the fact of how much do you really want to know about your genetic code? Like you were saying, that even though it is a bit like going to the psychic, isn't it? And is there something about finding out all the good things, and at what point does someone stop? So it sort of came in kind of a bit of a millionaire kind of scenario of what do people really want to know, and how far does it go?
I mean, that's been done on television. The trouble is that the commercial companies who do it, to summarise a long story, are crooks. They use very crude technology, and they can't really tell you. It's interesting that Jim Watson, a man with interesting views on numerous subjects, he had his DNA sequenced about 3 years ago now, and he revealed the code with the exception of one segment, which comes in 2 flavours, and if you have one particular flavour, you're more likely to get early onset Alzheimer's. And he didn't want people to know. Craig Venter, who's also an interesting character, he did it to his 2 sets of DNA, and he blithely announced the whole lot, including the fact that he was at risk of early heart disease, and that he had a personality which led him to lose his temper, which anybody who knows him would know already.
Okay, well maybe we should open this up to the audience. There's some microphones running around. Don't. If there's anyone got any questions, come on. There we go. Question over. Wait for the microphones to arrive, and then we'll get our questions. And think of some more questions. Those that don't have their hands up. You, sir.
Thank you. Very entertaining. Thanks a lot. When I saw the title, When Science Not Science, the first thing it made me think about was this absence of scientific process that you see on the television. Do you not think that? I mean, and whereby I acknowledge that these breakthroughs or the journey can be quite long, do you not think there's a mechanism, a way that we can be found to get it on TV? I mean, things like Coppers on Channel 4, which are very successfully showing the more human side of the police. I think not to have some of the process in science is a little bit a disservice to science itself.
David, again, Kim, you've already spoken to that to some extent. David, what do you think about getting the process of science?
It's really quite a tough thing. I mean, I've tried it. I think trying to do a kind of observational documentary, it has been tried before. It's really, really difficult, and it's partly to do with when you do an observational documentary, you have to rely on what everyone says. And if you went to Steve Lab, I would find it much easier to make a film that was, I think you could actually make a film about snails, incidentally. I think if you've got enough enthusiasm with a scientist, you can do anything. I've made a film with E.O. Wilson about ants, and we went out, and this is a 79-year-old man. He doesn't even have to be a cool, T-shirt-wearing kid, but he turned into a kid when he discovered a new species, and he put that little ant on the microscope, and he examined it, and that was exciting. He came alive in a kind of amazing way, and I think if people can see that enthusiasm, you can actually those little moments, if you can capture them, are good. They don't happen that often, so it's difficult. And the other thing is that, when you try and... most of the conversations that you have with your colleagues, I'm sure, would be completely impenetrable if you were just kind of observing.
They'd probably be unbroadcastable, that's for sure.
Kim wants to come back
to
on that.
add one thing to what David was saying, that I think just sort of... my take on it is that at the moment, right now, what I'm really interested in cracking is less how we show process in science, because I haven't, frankly, found the answer to that. What I am very, very interested in, and I think it speaks to your point, is personality in science. And I think we've done an unsophisticated job of conveying, what someone's feeling and thinking about, and the kind of the sort of just how incredibly interesting scientists can be as people, actually. And there's something in that I think might provide, that I'm very intrigued by at the moment, and might provide a route through to illuminating kind of scientific process without doing it sort of head on, to me.
Next question, yeah. Sitting next to you, yeah.
Hi, Lindsay Keith, Refinery Productions. Women and girls are still horribly underrepresented in science careers, in science higher education, and even still today on science TV. Other than putting forward and trying to find good female presenters, what else can you do as part of your public service remit to make sure that girls, when they're younger, are encouraged to do science and not be put off and not end up, pink princesses? Because it starts really young, and nothing's being done to really address the fact that, they're being pigeonholed at a really early age. BBC's about to do a James May programme about why men aren't men anymore, because they can't drill holes in walls. It's like you're just reinforcing that point the whole time, that it's not for women, it's not for girls.
Well, let's get a few responses to that, because it's an important point. Why don't we start with Steve? Do you recognise that picture, that it skews male, that there's a sense of the scientist on television, or even if we have female presenters, the atmosphere is a very male atmosphere?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Having said that, I know the figures for biological sciences in the UK are 55% female. If you go into the medical school, oh, well, God, yeah. Exactly. Imperial College, do me a favour. It's full of depressed chemists in brown lab suits with Bunsen burners in their pockets. But I think you're right, that's true. I'd say something which is, a bit politically incorrect. There is pretty good evidence of difference in spatial ability versus verbal ability between men and women. And there's pretty good evidence, and I'm not saying that's genetic or environmental, that if you give boys versus girls mathematical tests, boys tend to do slightly better. That is closing, and it may well be that things will change. But I think we have to accept there may be some differences which may have some biological coding.
Well, so you're saying men may be better at science?
No,
Stick to the cooking.
I mean, I'm...
You and Jim Watson.
No, strangely and bizarrely enough, my own trade, genetics, if you look at the history of genetics, without question, some of the very, very best and most ingenious science has been done by women. But I don't think that's an interesting break, really. I mean, I think you're right in that historically, if you went back to Tomorrow's World, it was a male universe. If you went back to when I was an undergraduate in the 60s, it wasn't a completely male universe, it was pretty damn male, particularly if you were at Oxbridge. It has really changed completely now, and I think that's a big improvement.
Let's say this quickly, that there have been more female science presenters, hopefully, on television, a bit more. We're trying to do stuff. But I know it's not enough, and that's your question, but just to acknowledge that, from Alice Roberts to kind of Joy Reidenberg in David's programme to Kathy Sykes and others, but that's not enough. What else can we do, Kim? What else can we do, Kate, to kind of to encourage a female audience in science, change the perception of it being a very male subject? What would you say, Kate, first?
Well, I think it is getting people when they're very, very young. And I know that sort of we do extremely soft science, but I would love it if through watching something like Embarrassing Bodies or whatever, people got, by the very explanation, by making it accessible, someone realised that it was interesting. I wish I had as a child, because I didn't, and I'm exactly that. I did arts because girls do art. And now I would love it if we could, either through something we do or find a way of really nailing the point that science is a fascinating and exciting area for girls. And our programmes are more female-centric, and so
I think you could possibly slightly help that if you weren't scared of calling it science. The thing with Sarah Beanie, it was science, but someone could watch that and come away saying, well, I understood, why houses subside, but they wouldn't think, oh, I learned some science today, because you don't call it that. and like because you're scared because you think it's not cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's finding a way that you still bring that audience in, and they leave knowing that they're taken in science, and that is a challenge, and it's something that we should definitely look at. And it would be an exciting challenge for us, and I do think we try, but yeah, maybe we should go further.
We should take some more questions. There's a man in the glasses back there standing up. Can we wait for the microphone, please? And then we've got another one back behind you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Peter Hamilton from documentarytelevision.com. I'm just wondering about the international co-production aspects of science programming. Is there a tsunami of quality science programs going from here to the States? And is similar program being funded in the States? What's going on?
David, you can.
Well, it's a sore point actually, because Inside Nature's Giants, which was co-produced with the Americans, they ended up backing out of it. And in fact, it was only the Wellcome Trust that came to our rescue that meant that the second series could go ahead. I think it's really difficult. I think what's happening certainly on somewhere like the channels that we normally co-produce with, like Nat Geo, I think there is less science. I mean, it's hard. Discovery is going through a bit of a transformation, I think, and I've noticed that they're getting more interested in science again. It seems to oscillate.
Does BBC Science co-produce a lot with other?
We co-produce massively. I mean, particularly with Discovery, but also with Nat Geo, with the French, with the Germans. I mean, we literally would find it extremely difficult to do what we do if we couldn't tap the co-production market. I think David's right. I think it's getting harder. The climate's getting tougher. Everybody's going through convulsions. I think Discovery, well, particularly the DigiNet, Discovery Science. Interestingly, the military channel, some of those smaller DigiNets who can bring...
The military channel?
Yeah.
I didn't even know there was a military channel. Sounds ominous to me. But I don't think I want to work with the military channel. If they're watching, they can get lost.
I would say, in general, I mean, certainly probably two-thirds to three-quarters of our output is co-produced with some form of American network in the science area, definitely.
Well, we do a lot of I think it's easier to co-produce science programs than other forms of programs often. So history programs tend to be more British history for a British audience, American history and so on, whereas science at least can be international in terms of breakthroughs. Let's take another question from further back there. Thank you very much. Gentleman there. Thank you. Hello, Roger.
Hi, it's Roger Gray from Films of Record. I just wanted to comment on the business about obdocs and drug design, because we did a film a couple of years ago, some of you may have seen, called Malaria Fever Road and the Search for the Vaccine, where they threw up two problems which are relevant to your panel and to the commissioners here. One is that we thought the story was very straightforward. We thought they were going to find we were promised, as it were, they were going to find a malaria vaccine in 18 months and the race for Stockholm and who would get to the Nobel Prize. And about 3 months in, we realized that it was no longer a race, it was a struggle and a wander. And, and I had to go back to the BBC and say, look, it's not a race. I don't know how long it's going to last. And it was pretty tough going. And it's greatly to Richard Klein's credit that he kept going. And then we had to go to the Gates Foundation. Anyway, long story short, 3 years later, they failed. And that was the end of the film. But the scientists said, and I think Steve was very nice about the film when it was shown, that it was, for them, the most truthful film they'd seen about science, because it was about failure. And I just wanted to there were two issues, therefore, for you guys. It is about drug design. It was very interesting, and even PBS showed it, although they didn't show it well because nobody in America cares about malaria, unquote. But nevertheless, from a budgetary point of view, how do you get into something that is that open-ended and is likely to be about failure? Both of those are slightly taboo in commissioning terms.
Yeah, we try and avoid failure in Channel 4 Science, but I mean, maybe the BBC don't mind it. I don't know. What do you
mean? We do. We need audiences too, and I think that sounds. I think there are few and far between occasions where you can afford, in every sense, I don't just mean financially, to do a project like that with that degree of risk in terms of sort of narrative satisfaction for the audience. I mean, we're fundamentally, what we do, all of us in this room, is we ask people to give up an hour of their lives, possibly 3 hours if it's, and devote that to something. It's got to be worth their while. And we have to hold ourselves to a very, very high standard in terms of, we really promise you this is going to be worth you sitting down to watch what we've made, rather than spending the time with your kids or in the garden or whatever else it is that you like doing. That's a very tough bar to hit.
Well, it did win lots of prizes, and it was a very good watch, but it's still, you know, you're left wondering, what are we going to do about malaria? So it's more difficult watch, but it's not a bad watch.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting because commissioning editors we like to say we take risk, but actually those kind of risks often, you know, think, oh no, 3 years, no result, failure. That's not the kind of risk I like, you know what I mean? But actually, you only get magical things. The only chance of capturing a breakthrough in that way would have been to take that risk. I'm sure you still made a great film. Anyone else? Yes, question here. We wait for a microphone, please.
Hello, Nikki Huggett from Windfall. Hello. Question following on from what Kate said about starting them young. And Kim, I know you commission across 1, 2 and 4, but I was just wondering if you had any influence, or we're going to have influence on BBC Three or CBBC, because we get so many people saying, oh, my kids love Inside Nature's Giants, or my teens are really interested in science. And I just feel that it's missing a trick a little bit not to have Specialist Factual so focused on those channels.
Great question. Yeah, does BBC Three have science on it?
I don't look after BBC Three. BBC Three is looked after by Harry, which doesn't mean that they don't do science. It's just that I don't look. I think, you know, some of what was that programme called about for freaky eaters? I thought was a brilliant science programme. And I'm a huge fan of embarrassing illnesses, and you know, it's I think stuff in that tap into sort of those territories absolutely is science. I don't think I'm the only person that does science at the BBC, but I don't think I'll be doing science for BBC Three anytime soon. But in terms of the lady's question over there, frankly, BBC Three is too late. You know, if its audience starts at 24, that's not the point at which you're going to be deciding whether to take up a science career or not. So the question about CBBC is much more pertinent, I think, and CBBC actually does quite a bit of science, from Richard Hammond's Blast Lab through to a bunch of other things, and we're trying to do more and more with them. When we did Brian's solar system series, we did a tie-in called Space Hoppers with CBBC. And also the other thing to remember is a huge number, particularly beyond sort of middle-class families who all put their kids to bed at sort of nice and early in the evening. A vast number of children are watching television, mainstream adult television, at 9 o'clock. So the output that we put on there is not inaccessible to them. The number of families watching Jimmy's Food Factory and Banger's Theory is really, really high. So I think we are reaching a younger audience more and more. As I was saying earlier on, BBC Two skews science, and BBC Two skews younger than any other factual genre, and that's because of families watching together, watching Ian Stewart together, watching Alice Roberts together, watching Solar System with Brian together. So I think we are reaching younger people. I think the question about whether we're reaching them with the right messages or with sufficient numbers of sort of female-friendly or girl-friendly is a really, really apposite one, and I think that does deserve some attention.
Last question, just here, we get a microphone here. One last question, and then we should really probably wrap up. Maybe one more after this.
Hi, my name is Annette Wagner. I'm a documentary filmmaker and producer of cross-media productions. My question is whether you're ready to combine scientific documentaries with, let's say, a browser game. My subject is dementia at the moment. I'm making a documentary on emotional robotics used in dementia therapy. Over a period of 5 months, emotional robot is tested and planted in a care home. And we're heading for a browser game on dementia as well. So is there any interaction between scientific programs, and is there an openness to head for web audience as well?
I think the answer is hugely moving in that direction. Behind you, Daniel Glazer from the Wellcome Trust, I saw nodding vigorously, because the Wellcome Trust actually is hugely proactive in encouraging both kind of not just television, but also often funding the websites connected to television programs. And we have huge kind of initiatives. I mean, probably everyone on this panel could say something about that. You have many websites which are connected to, say, embarrassing bodies. I mean, maybe you should talk about that quickly.
It's been amazing, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive success and an entity in itself, which lives outside of the programme, and is hugely carries the public service message in a different entity, and has, we've made the first live sort of switch over on the internet. So we look at all the ways that our cross-platform can be worked with the programme, but also lives on its own. So it is definitely an area that we're interested in, and that we work together all the time very closely. So they're
by comparison, we at the BBC have just had all of that cut, so you're probably going to be seeing less of that from the BBC.
We're sort of going further with it, I think.
We should probably
that includes games as well.
Sorry.
That includes games as well.
Yes.
All right.
Well, as far as I know, yes, it will do. I mean, it sort of includes everything that we actively look at how our reach can work outside the programme.
Since we're talking about science in a chapel, I'll quickly tell you a story about working with Richard Dawkins, who I work with. He phoned me up at the crack of dawn Saturday morning about 7:30 a.m. I was incredibly hungover. He goes, Richard Dawkins here. I go, what's Richard? What? He goes, you filmed me giving a talk like one of these sort of things, and you put it on the Channel 4 internet. And I'm like, Christ, you know, what's the problem? And he goes, I misspeak at minute 13:40. You've got to get that off the internet. Oh, Christ. I was trying to find out who does the internet for the science programs on Channel 4, and, you know, I should know that. And I kind of tracked them down. I spent most of my Saturday getting Richard Dawkins' thing to the Cheltenham Science Festival off the internet. And I say to the guy who finally takes it down, well, what does he say at minute 13:40 or whatever? And what he means to say is, evolution is true, and I can prove it. But he mistakenly says, religion is true, and I can prove it. And he was terrified that the creationists would get their hands on this video. Anyway, if he ever misbehaves in his contract negotiations, I have the tape ready to go onto YouTube. Thank you very much to the Wellcome Trust, and thank you to my panel.